listening to a Purple Crayon Productions broadcast.
Hi, I'm Sophie Falvey. I'm a 20-year-old history minor and I have access to JSTOR through my college. Using this incredible power, I'm going to do my best to guide you through the history of monsters and other scary things from the modern horror canon. From their possible origins, all the way through their pop culture cameos in recent years. It's a little bit of folklore, a little bit of true crime, and a lot of those weird moments in history that lie in that liminal zone just between the logical and the completely unaccountable. This is Mystic History. Lycanthropy Edition. Welcome to Mystic History. I'm really excited to be starting this series. Now, before we begin, I want to be very clear that this is pop history. It's whittled down to be consumed within the about 30 minutes that this podcast will be. And I'll be covering hundreds of years of history and many different events. So if you want a fuller, more scholarly take on anything I happen to mention, feel free to head over to the sources that are linked on our website. I also want to add that I'm going to be doing my best in this series to follow one of my favorite quotes of all time, written by L.P. Hartley, which is, quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Which is to say that the monsters I talk about were often very real parts of people's lives, and that I believe that that reality should be treated with respect, especially because it often had violent consequences. So, on that note, werewolves.
He's always wanted to be something special, but he never expected this. And tonight is his night to howl. Teen Wolf, a new comedy with Michael J. Fox, star of Back to the Future.
You know them from any number of films, TV shows, books, and even video games. And anyone who's seen or read any of those things or even lived through enough Halloweens can tell you a couple things about werewolves. 1, that they're people, often men, but not always, who turn into wolves. 2, that they become werewolves by being bitten by other werewolves. 3, that they transform at full moon and often cannot control the violent things they do. And 4, that a silver bullet will kill them. So I want to start way back with this one, because werewolves, like a lot of monsters, have collected a lot of lore over the years, and especially in the 20th century, when they became popular in Hollywood movies. None of the werewolf rules have really ever been hard and fast rules. The silver bullet rule only really came about in the 1941 film The Wolfman as a narrative tool, and the same goes for many other things we associate with werewolves. They're all relatively recent. Yet what I do want to talk about, though, is something that I think is common to werewolf myths since prehistoric times, and that's the concept of embodiment. What I mean by that is something having to do with the body, with something corporeal that takes up space in the world. The concept of werewolves is part of a larger set of stories and ideas that we collectively call animal transformation myths. So these stories can be found in pretty much every culture around the world, and even more interestingly, wolf transformation myths specifically can be found all around the world too. Every culture that comes into contact with wolves seems to have a version of the werewolf story. And in cultures that don't live with wolves, the myth takes on whatever the largest predatory mammal is. This could be lions, leopards, and even jaguars. Some people, including Caroline Taylor Stewart in her book The Origin of the Werewolf Superstition, suggest that the origin of the werewolf story comes from prehistoric Indo-European hunting practices. She thinks that hunters wear the pelts of wolves as a sort of camouflage to become what they were hunting in order to hunt it better. This theory is still practiced in many modern cultures today. Just think of duck hunters who use camouflage and decoys in order to lure ducks closer to them. Stewart takes this idea a step further, theorizing that these prehistoric wolf men would then participate in religious ritual, further literally becoming the wolf. Of course, animal transformation is fundamentally about the body, as it's a human body becoming an animal body, but in exploring the history of werewolves, we'll specifically see a lot of examples of the physical mixture of human and wolf bodies in order to invoke wolf transformation. I'd also like to mention here that I haven't really been able to pinpoint an exact moment when the belief in physical, actual werewolves began. There are a couple reasons for this, the first being that since animal transformation myths happen in every culture, different cultures will behave differently about them. And the second being that Stewart's essay is the only work I was able to find on prehistoric relationships to the werewolf myth. Of course, there are other theories about its origin, including one that credits a certain set of genetic diseases that cause the disintegration of the nose and ears, leading to what could be described as a more wolf-like appearance. But no one can really put a date on when these stories of wolf transformation became reality. It seems to me like their integration into religious ceremony, with performers embodying wolves like Stewart suggested they would have, made it more of a reality by including the transformative power of the spiritual world. Wow. And then there's the Epic of Gilgamesh, which some people point to as the first written case of werewolfism or something like it. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a Mesopotamian epic that is sometimes regarded as the first recorded great work of literature. Gilgamesh is a great Mesopotamian king who first comes into conflict with Enkidu, who's a wild man raised by animals outside of Gilgamesh's settled society. While Enkidu is described as hairy and brawny and in many ways physically akin to the animals he lives with, it's not a case of animal transformation as much as it is a case of Enkidu being shut out of society because of his animal-like traits. So it's not strictly a case of werewolfism, but it certainly has a lot in common with many cases of wolf transformation we'll see later. The people in these stories exist outside of society in some way, or break social codes that get them pushed out of society. So a great example of sort of breaking social codes is King Lycaon, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's the pronunciation I'm going to use. The King Lycaon of Arcadia. This is an ancient Greek story recorded in Ovid's Metamorphoses. In it, King Lycaon attempts to serve the god Zeus a dish of human flesh. In some versions, it's the flesh of his own son. Zeus is so enraged by this violation of the social code, you don't give gods human flesh, that he transforms Lycaon into a wolf. Now, Lycaon was the first mythical king of Arcadia, a region in Greece that in ancient times was plagued by wolves. In Plato's Republic, as well as in writings by Pliny the Elder and Pausanias, another pronunciation, we see something practiced that is almost completely opposite to Lycaon's stories. According to these authors, participants in the religious cult of Zeus Lycaos would serve the god a mixture of animal and human flesh in a sacrificial feast. If a human ate from this feast, they too would be transformed into a wolf, and would only regain human form if they abstained from human flesh for 9 years. So another cool example of werewolfism in the ancient world is Herodotus, a Greek historian. Now he writes about the Nuri, a group of people living in Scythia, which is modern-day southern Siberia, and he says, quote, "The Scythians and the Greeks settled in Scythia say that once a year, every one of the Nuri is turned into a wolf, and after remaining so for a few days, returns again to his former shape. For myself, I cannot believe this tale, but they tell it nevertheless, yea, and swear to its truth." End quote. And the Romans, like the Greeks and so many other cultures, also had a term for werewolves. This was versipellis, or turnskin. Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer, actually complains about the belief in wolf transformation, which we know existed in Greece and evidently did in Rome too. He says, quote, "That men have been turned into wolves and again restored to their original form we must confidently look upon as untrue, unless indeed we are ready to believe all the tales which for so many ages have been found to be fabulous. But the belief of it has become so firmly fixed in the minds of the common people as to have caused the term versipellis to be used as a common form of imprecation." And this was written in about 77 AD. So it's important to remember that for as long as we've had werewolves, we've also had people who didn't believe in them at all. Of course, it seems like these people were often the educated elite, so it's hard to know just how much influence their personal beliefs had on the majority of people going about their daily lives. And this is exactly why I'm choosing to zero in on all these classical European writers. Werewolves and similar monsters exist in cultures outside of Europe, but because of the predominant cultural influences of our pop culture here in the US, and that's Europe, we need to look at classical European conceptions of wolf transformation. By the time we reach the Middle Ages in Europe, people interested in wolf transformation or werewolves will be turning to these classical writers. So, now let's move from classical societies to the Middle Ages. Werewolves in many stories continue to occupy much the same space as they have in the past. They're outside of society and fulfill that theme of embodiment that I keep bringing up, specifically mixing the human and wolf bodies. Interestingly, the medieval Norse term vargar means wolf, so vargshammer means either a wolf's shape or a wolf's pelt. And you see references to men taking on the shape of a wolf after putting on one of these wolf pelts. Author Heiðr Gudmundsdóttir, in her essay The Werewolf in Medieval Icelandic Literature, tells us that often in Norse sagas where this happens, the transformation of a man into a wolf is associated with battle, and that's often kind of negative. Interestingly, Gudmundsdóttir also tells us that Germanic peoples, and Norse is a Germanic language, used vargar to mean outlaw, someone who existed outside of society. People who, she says, were driven out of society and, quote, to the forest as if they were wolves. In Old Icelandic, the term vargtre means wolf tree or gallows, and vargdropi is a legal term that literally means wolf cub, but actually refers to the children of outlaws. Then there's the Armenian wolf women. These are women who have committed deadly sins. A spirit comes to them and gives them a wolf skin. The spirit then forces them to put on the skin, and they become, you guessed it, wolves. As wolves, these women lose control over themselves and become completely guided by their new wolf-like instincts. They kill their own children, and then their family's children, their nieces, nephews, their cousins, and then they begin to kill and eat any children they can find, regardless of who they are. Now, possibly the most horrifying part of this legend is the fact that as these vicious werewolves approach a house, the locks and doors all magically spring open for them. There's no way to guard yourself against them. Then when morning comes, they become human again and take off the skin, and this goes on for 7 years. I like this story not only because it's a great example of the physical merging of the wolf and human bodies that manifests as transformation, but also because there's this tendency for werewolf lore to get very wrapped up in ideas of the masculine. I mentioned before that Norse sagas associate wolf transformation with battle, and putting aside the whole debate about various Norse female warriors, it's traits like these, the idea that werewolves are vicious, strong, cruel, agile, and fast, that get them so entrenched in our ideas of masculinity. And I don't think that's such a good idea. I think that fundamentally these stories we've been discussing have more to do with societal transgression and expulsion than with anything innately masculine. There's a myth that werewolfism was the male counterpart to witchcraft, when in fact women were also tried. So we know that stories of werewolves are born out of wolf transformation stories, and that wolf transformation stories are part of a broader subgenre of folklore called animal transformation myths. But even within the scope of these animal transformation myths, a clear majority in Europe are wolf transformation. European folklore all across the continent seems obsessed with it. That's because for most of history, and certainly during the classical and medieval eras, the European continent was covered in wolves. They were the largest, strongest, and certainly most terrifying animal threat to humans, and abundant. The obsession with wolves in folklore, especially with their danger and unpredictability, is a direct and predictable result of the mortal fear people felt. Just look at European stories about wolves that we still tell today. There's Little Red Riding Hood, there's many versions of that one, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, or even The Three Little Pigs. All of these include the big bad wolf. Even more interestingly, they're all still thematically consistent with the things we associate with werewolf stories. Look how wolves terrorize the sheep, a domesticated, therefore civilized animal, in The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing or The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Or they terrorize the pigs, again domesticated, living in houses. Both of these things scream civilization. Or how in the Little Red Riding Hood story, we get that theme of embodiment as the wolf takes on the form of the human grandmother by donning her clothes and then swallows Little Red whole. So from that, I'm going to make a jump that may seem a little confusing at first, but trust me, I think it'll make sense. I'm jumping to the Fourth Lateran Council. The Fourth Lateran Council was a meeting of the Catholic clergy in 1215. The idea was to make sure that everyone agreed on what specifically it was that the church practiced, like mandatory confession, for example. Now, one of the things they agreed on was the idea of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is something that exists in Catholic religious practice to this day, as well as in the Church of England and the Episcopal Church. It means that during the sacrament of communion, in which participants drink wine and eat bread or wafers in some cases, the food and drink is literally transformed by the power of God to the blood and body of Christ, which is what it's associated with in the Bible. So thinkers like Gerald of Wales took this to mean that, by the power of God, a person could be transformed into a wolf. It only made sense. Not to mention that if Christ could be both a man and God, then a man could definitely be both a wolf and a man. In the early 13th century, Gervase of Tilbury actually justifies the transformation of the devil into a snake in the Garden of Eden, and the popular idea that some women could transform into snakes by saying, quote, "In England, we have often seen men change into wolves according to the phases of the moon. The Gauls call men of this kind Gerolfi, while the English name for them is werewolves," end quote. Werewolves are actually a great concept for these theologians to mess with precisely because there's so much about the body and corporeality. So there's actually widespread acceptance of the existence of werewolves by medieval religious thinkers, both Christian and Jewish, and they weave them into their theology. Rabbi Judah the Pious references, quote, women called stria, mares, and werewolves who were created at dusk, who perform an action and change their appearances, end quote. So this actually links werewolves to demons, who according to Jewish thinkers were created at dusk on the first Friday. I find it really interesting that the notion of werewolves in Judaism denies the phenomenon of embodiment much more than the Christian conception, which actually seems to focus on it. In Jewish theology, though, demons are not embodied. So it makes sense for werewolves, who are associated with demons, to be able to change, precisely because they have no body holding them in one shape. And all these things are examples of people folding the folkloric concept of the werewolf into their religious practice. That's something we're going to see much more of going forward. This concept that the wolf transformation is no longer associated with the spiritual world or with polytheistic gods, but with more monotheistic frameworks and, more specifically, the Christian idea of the devil. So now we're in the 16th century, or the early modern era, and things get kind of gory. I mentioned how werewolves start being associated with the devil, and they do. They've survived and they thrive really well in this new Christian framework. We see the concept of werewolfism begin to be associated with witchcraft and deals with the devil. And in the early modern era, where there is witchcraft, there are witchcraft trials. Specifically, in the 16th century, there are werewolf trials. So I'm going to take you through a few of these notoriously bloody trials and then really zero in on one. The first is from 1521. Pierre Bourgault, Michael Verdun, and Philbert Monteau are known as the werewolves of Pouligny. The story goes that a traveler passing through this area, which is obviously in France, was attacked by a wolf. He fought and managed to wound and scare off the wolf, who ran away bleeding. The traveler followed the trail of blood all the way to the house of a man named Michel Verdun, who was found still dripping blood. The traveler reported Verdun, who was arrested and tortured until he revealed the names of two other men, the other werewolves of Pouligny. Michel Bourgault then admitted to making a deal with three men in black in order to protect his sheep, which unbeknownst to him included renouncing God and his baptism. He also confessed to using an ointment that would turn him into a wolf. He confessed that as wolves, he and Verdun had murdered at least 2 children. All 3 men were executed and their bodies burned. And this story actually inspired the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Then, in 1572, the town of Dole, France, allegedly experienced a rash of murders of their children, who were found dismembered in the local woods. The murderer remained a mystery, until one day local men caught a wild animal attacking a child, and they realized that the animal possessed similar features to Gilles Garnier, a local hermit. As soon as another child disappeared a week later, Garnier and his wife were arrested. After 50 witnesses testified against him, Garnier was placed on the rack, a torture device that was used in the early modern era that incrementally stretched a person's limbs out to such a degree that they eventually dislocated, and then separated. Garnier confessed not only to turning into a wolf and hunting and killing the children that entered the local woods, but also to taking them home and eating the meat with his wife. In 1573, he was burned at the stake. One slightly less upsetting example comes a bit later. In 1653, the people of this German town were plagued by a local vicious wolf, and they knew exactly who it was. It was their old, dead mare, who they hated. So they got a hunting party together, killed the wolf, chopped off its nose, dressed it in human clothing, put a human mask on it, and hung it in the town square. Now that's absurd, but it's also a really good example of embodiment, mixing the wolf and human bodies, like I keep talking about. In 1598, another body was discovered in another forest in France. This time, it belonged to a teenage boy, and a man was discovered half naked and covered in blood only a little ways away. This was Jacques Roulet, who, without being tortured, confessed to this and to several other murders, saying he had used an ointment to transform himself into a wolf in order to kill and eat people. We get this account from Sabine Baring-Gould, who published it in 1865, and the courtroom dialogue she provides is frankly kind of chilling. Roulet says, quote, "I killed and ate the child Cornier. I was a wolf." The judge asks, "Were you dressed as a wolf?" Quote, "I was dressed as I am now. I had my hands and my face bloody because I had been eating the flesh of the said child." Later, Roulet says, quote, "I used my teeth. My head was as it is today. I have wounded and eaten many other little children. I have also been to the Sabbath." End quote. In his trial, Roulet was found to be, quote, feeble-minded, and instead of being executed, was sentenced to an asylum and religious education. And finally, there's Peter Stube, or the Werewolf of Bedburg in 1589, and this one's actually kind of famous. So we get all our evidence about the life and crimes of Peter Stube from a frankly kind of salacious pamphlet that was published first in his native Germany, but that got so popular that it was translated and reprinted in London. Stube apparently made a deal with the devil, which granted him a belt that transformed him into a wolf so he could, quote, work his malice on men, women, and children in the shape of some beast. And the pamphlet goes into vivid detail about his wolf form, too. His, quote, eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like unto brands of fire, end quote. And allegedly, over 25 years, Stube killed and ate multiple victims, including his own son, and committed incest with his daughter. And it actually only gets really bad after his capture. Stube was lashed to a wheel, where the flesh was literally ripped and burned from his body with hot pincers. They broke his arms and legs. Then they chopped off his head. Then they burned the body. To really bring it home, his girlfriend and daughter, also accused of incest, were also tortured and then burned alive. Finally, the people of Bedburg took Stube's still intact head and put it on the body of a wolf and hung it in the town square, supposedly as a warning against anyone contemplating a deal with the devil, murder, cannibalism, and incest, but also another really good example of the literal mixture of human and wolf bodies. Right, so the horror of everything I just said aside, we have to listen to these accounts responsibly. Gilles Garnier and Peter Stube, for example, were both tortured pretty horribly. That would be enough to get a confession, no matter how true or untrue, out of many people. The Peter Stube pamphlet is also perhaps best compared to early modern and maybe less than responsible true crime. The emphasis is on how lurid the whole thing is. That's the selling point of the pamphlet, not fairness to the accused. And perhaps most importantly, these trials all happened hundreds of years ago. We have to accept that we'll never be able to go back and use our own modern understanding of the world to analyze the evidence. We have to accept that it's filtered through the early modern worldview, which for many people contained werewolves. In some ways, the guilt or innocence of these people has to remain a mystery. One possibility, though, has to do with the true crime nature of it all. Some historians think that through a modern lens, these people would be considered criminally insane, like serial killers. They suggest that integrating werewolf folklore was the early modern way of understanding things as horrific as these crimes. And, to me that makes sense. It's not a difficult leap to make. We know werewolves are vicious and capable of killing. Why shouldn't they be suspicious that there's something supernatural like that at work? Of course, modern historians aren't the only ones that point to criminal insanity. I've been mentioning people like ancient writers who were skeptical of wolf transformation. Well, despite the popularity of werewolf trials, that skepticism didn't die out. Many of these skeptics drew on classical skepticism in wolf transformation, specifically the lycanthropy diagnosis. Lycanthropy, the root of which you'll recognize from lykeos or lykeon, was originally an ancient Greek medical diagnosis for a kind of criminal insanity in which the sufferer believed themselves to be transformed into a wolf. Clinical lycanthropy is actually still a diagnosis today, although now it gets subsumed more into schizophrenia diagnoses. It sort of gets tacked on to those. You see the medical view of werewolfism during these early modern werewolf trials as well. I mentioned before that they were linked to witchcraft, but Reginald Scott, the author of the popular witch hunting manual, The Discovery of Witches, actually takes great pains to divorce witchcraft from werewolfism, which he describes simply as a, quote, overabundance of melancholy, end quote. Of course, keep in mind that Scott was English, a country that hadn't had the same abundance of werewolf trials, and this was probably because wolves had been hunted to extinction on the British Isles much sooner than they would be on continental Europe. And it's worth noting that Scott didn't have to fear wolves on a daily basis. So following the trials, we see werewolf folklore eventually get picked back up and popularized again by the Gothic genre in the 19th century and short stories. And that's when it enters horror literature. When werewolves stop being a phenomenon that operates in the zone between folklore, organized religion, and concrete reality, and become something even more mythologized and, I would argue, removed from reality. But these stories were, consciously or not, feeding into a tradition of werewolves. Gothic lit is all about the chaos and unpredictability of the natural world, things that exist outside of civilized society or are even cast out from it. Just like werewolves always have been, ever since Gilgamesh. And following its popularity in horror literature, the burgeoning film industry realizes that it can do pretty cool things with the werewolf genre as well. The first werewolf sound film is called The Werewolf of London, and as a narrative tool, introduces the idea that all werewolves become afflicted with lycanthropy through the bite of another werewolf. And I mentioned earlier that the whole silver bullet thing comes out of the film The Wolfman from 1941. Regardless, though, there don't seem to be any hard and fast rules about werewolves, except that they're vicious killers and wolves, and tend to be alienated from society. Actually, the more research I did into werewolves and lycanthropy, the more I began to see the werewolf archetype depicted outside of just media specifically about werewolves. I mean, it's the stereotype we have about most serial killers. Antisocial, already outside of society, or similar characters like JD from Heathers. I think that fundamentally, werewolves are our fear of the animal, of a natural world untamable by human society. They reflect our understanding that there will always be something bigger, faster, and stronger than we are. The fear that we'll always be prey to a completely uncontrollable, completely feral predator. Sleep well, I guess.
Cricket Girls